The wax seal on the final envelope hadn't even fully hardened when the heavy rhythmic thud of a horse's gallop shattered the silence of the valley. Eliza Starling froze, her fingers stained with the midnight blue of cheap ink, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. For 4 months she had lived in a world of paper and prayer, pouring her soul into 40 letters addressed to a dying man she had never met, Jack Dawson, a soldier purportedly gasping his last breaths in a cold infirmary 300 miles away. She had told him things she hadn't whispered to her own reflection: her fear of the encroaching winter, the way the jasmines smelled when the moon was high, and the terrifying truth that she was falling in love with a ghost. She believed she was a light in his darkening world, a final comfort before the silence of the grave claimed him. But as the shadow of a massive coal-black stallion fell across her weathered porch, the air in the small cottage turned frigid. This wasn't the arrival of a messenger bearing a black-rimmed notice of death. The man dismounting was draped in heavy charcoal wool and fine leather, his movements possessing a lethal, predatory grace that didn't belong to a broken infantryman. Before she could even stand, the door creaked open and there he stood, towering, silver-eyed and radiating a terrifyingly familiar aura of power. This wasn't Jack. This was the man the newspapers called the Iron Heart, a man whose wealth could buy the very valley she stood in. As he stepped into the dim light of her candle, his voice didn't crack with the weakness of a dying soldier. It rumbled with the weight of 1,000 secrets. He leaned in, the scent of expensive sandalwood and rain-drenched earth filling her senses, and whispered the words that set her world on fire. "Forgive me, Eliza. I am the Duke. Hello to every single one of you joining us today. I am so incredibly moved to have you here for this journey. Before we dive deeper into this tangled web of ink and lies, I have to ask, where in this beautiful world are you watching from? Please let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. How are you all doing today? I truly hope your hearts are light. If you haven't already, it would mean the world to me if you hit that subscribe button and joined our storytelling family. Your support is the ink that keeps these stories flowing, and we have so much more to explore together. Eliza stared at the man before her, her breath hitching in a throat that felt suddenly lined with glass. The letters, her 40 letters, were clutched in his gloved hand, the ribbons she'd used to bind them now frayed and salt-stained. He wasn't pale. He wasn't trembling. He looked like he could command an army or dismantle a kingdom with a single glance. The vulnerability she had shared with Jack now felt like a weapon held at her own throat. Who was this stranger who had feasted on her most private thoughts while wearing a mask of tragedy? Was the love she felt real, or was it just a masterful performance by a bored aristocrat? The silence that followed the Duke's confession was thick, heavy with the scent of old paper and the sharp metallic tang of the winter air bleeding in through the open door. Eliza Starling felt a cold shiver race down her spine, but it wasn't from the draft. It was the realization that the sanctuary she had built within her letters was a house of cards, and this man, this titan of industry and bloodline, had just breathed on it. To understand the weight of her silence, one must understand the isolation of Eliza's world. Living in a cottage that seemed held together by ivy and memory, Eliza was the daughter of a disgraced academic, Thomas Starling, who had left her nothing but a library of leather-bound dreams and a debt to the local grain merchant. Her days were a rhythmic blur of mending lace for the village gentry and tending to a garden that yielded more stones than vegetables. She was a woman of in-between, too educated for the laborers, too poor for the elites. Her only true companions were the ink pots and the quills that allowed her to escape her gray reality. Her deepest fear wasn't poverty, it was irrelevance. She terrified herself with the thought that she would live and die in this valley without ever truly being seen by another soul. When the notice arrived months ago from the War Office, asking for volunteers to write to unclaimed wounded soldiers to boost morale, she hadn't seen it as a chore. She had seen it as a lifeline. Then there was Jack Dawson, or the man she thought was Jack. In her mind, he was a farm boy with a poetic soul, a man who, in his final hours, needed to know that someone cared about the color of the sunset or the way the frost patterned the windows. She had poured her deepest motivations into those pages. Her desire to travel beyond the mountains, her secret grief over her father's passing, and the terrifying vulnerability of her own lonely heart. She had become his tether to life, or so she believed. But the man standing in her kitchen was William Darcy, the Duke of Ashbourne. He was a man defined by a different kind of isolation, the isolation of a throne. Rumored to be as cold as the marble in his ancestral estate, William had spent his life surrounded by people who wanted something from him. A title, a favor, a piece of his vast fortune. He was a man who had never been spoken to without a title attached, never looked at without a ledger in the onlooker's eyes. Behind him, framed by the doorway, stood his equerry, a stout and nervous man named Alfred Pennyworth, who looked as though he wanted to bolt back to the safety of the carriage. Alfred was the only one who knew the Duke's secret, that after a minor skirmish near the border where the Duke had been briefly hospitalized under a pseudonym to avoid a political frenzy, he had received a letter. A letter from a woman who didn't know he was a duke. A woman who wrote to him as if he were just a man. William looked around the humble room, his eyes lingering on the stack of parchment on the table. He saw the fraying rug, the single candle, and the sheer raw honesty of the life he had intruded upon. He wasn't the arrogant, iron heart the papers described. In this moment his shoulders were slumped with a weight heavier than any crown. He had sought comfort without the burden of his rank, desperate to be loved for his mind rather than his coffers. But in doing so he had stolen the one thing Eliza prized above all, the truth. The tension in the room was a living thing. Eliza's gaze dropped to the Duke's hands. They were calloused, yes, but they were the hands of a man who held the reins of power, not the hands of a soldier who had crawled through the mud. She felt a surge of empathy for the Jack she had lost, mixed with a sudden, sharp intrigue for the man who had taken his place. Who was he, really, if he had to lie to be heard? "You read them all," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Every word. Every secret I never intended for a duke to hear." William stepped forward, the floorboards groaning under his polished boots. "I didn't just read them, Eliza. I lived for them. They were the only honest thing in my world." The flickering candlelight cast long, dancing shadows against the peeling wallpaper of the kitchen, making the Duke's presence feel even more overwhelming. Eliza stepped back, her heel catching on a loose floorboard. The air felt charged, as if a storm were breaking inside the four walls of her home. She looked at the 40 letters in his hand, her soul bound in twine, and felt a wave of nausea. "You weren't dying," she breathed, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "I spent nights weeping for a man who didn't exist. I prayed for your lungs to clear, for your fever to break. And you were sitting in a palace, reading my grief like it was a morning gazette." William's face contorted, a flicker of genuine agony crossing his aristocratic features. "I was wounded, Eliza. Not by a bullet, but by the suffocating weight of a life where every word is a calculation. When your first letter arrived, addressed to a Private Jack Dawson, a name I gave to the field hospital to avoid the vultures of the press, I intended to throw it away. But then I read the first line." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, resonant hum. "You wrote, 'I do not know your face, but I know the silence of a house that has forgotten how to laugh.' In that moment, for the first time in 30 years, I wasn't a duke. I was just a man who was lonely. I didn't mean for it to go on, but I became addicted to your honesty. I became addicted to you." Before Eliza could find her voice to cast him out, a frantic pounding erupted at her front door, not the measured thud of a nobleman, but the desperate rhythmic hammering of someone fleeing for their life. Alfred, the Duke's equerry, didn't wait for an invitation. He burst inside, his face ashen, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Your Grace. We were followed from the capital. It's the Vane Syndicate's men. Victor Vane has sent his enforcers. They know you're away from the garrison. They don't just want the documents. They want the head of the man who blocked their trade routes." The atmosphere shifted instantly from a romantic betrayal to a theater of war. William's posture straightened, the vulnerability vanishing as his hand instinctively flew to the hilt of the sword hidden beneath his greatcoat. Eliza watched as the Jack she had imagined, the fragile soldier, was completely replaced by a commander of men. "How many, Alfred?" William barked. 6, maybe more. They're closing off the valley road." They saw the carriage, Alfred wheezed, glancing terrified at Eliza. William turned back to Eliza, his silver eyes burning with a mixture of protectiveness and guilt. "Eliza, listen to me. By coming here I have put you in grave danger. These men are not soldiers, they are butchers. If they find me here they will leave no witnesses. I need to get you to the cellar, or you must flee through the woods to the old chapel." The central challenge was no longer about a lie. It was about survival. Eliza looked at the man she had loved through ink and paper. He was a liar, a deceiver, and a high-born stranger, but as she heard the distant whistle of a scout in the woods outside, she saw the sheer terror in Alfred's eyes. She had a choice. She could point the Duke toward the back door and save herself, or she could step into the line of fire for the man who had stolen her heart under false pretenses. "The cellar is damp and the door is rotted," Eliza said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the trembling of her hands. She reached out and snatched her letters back from his hand, her eyes flashing with a sudden, fierce determination. "If they are Vane's men, they know this valley. But they don't know my house. There is a crawl space behind the pantry hidden by the spice rack. It leads to the old well shaft. I won't hide while you face them," William said, his jaw set in a hard line. "You aren't hiding," she countered, stepping into his space, her heart racing as she felt the heat radiating from him. "You're surviving. Because if you die today, I'll never get the chance to tell you how much I truly hate you for what you've done." The first major twist struck then. As Eliza moved toward the pantry, the window shattered. A heavy lead weight wrapped in a message crashed onto the floor. William lunged, shielding Eliza with his own body as glass rained down on them. He rolled to his feet, shielding her as he picked up the note. His face went pale. It wasn't a demand for money. It was a copy of her first letter to Jack, stained with blood. "They didn't just follow me," William whispered, his voice trembling with a new kind of fear. "They've been intercepting our correspondence for weeks. They didn't come for me, Eliza. They came because they think you are the key to breaking me." The shock of it nearly knocked the wind out of her. Her private words, her deepest vulnerabilities, were now in the hands of monsters. The attraction she felt for this powerful, dangerous man was suddenly eclipsed by the sheer terror of the stakes. "Why?" she whispered. "Why am I the key?" William looked at her, his gaze filled with a raw, terrifying intensity. "Because in 40 letters you gave me a reason to want to live. And they know it." The air in the cottage grew heavy, thick with the scent of wet pine and the metallic tang of the Duke's drawn sword. Outside, the rhythmic crunch of boots on frozen mud signaled that the hunters were no longer hiding. They were encircling the house like wolves around a wounded doe. "Into the crawl space. Now," William commanded, his voice a low, vibrating rasp. He didn't wait for her protest. He gripped Eliza's waist, his touch startlingly warm through her thin cotton dress, and hoisted her toward the narrow opening behind the pantry's spice rack. As they squeezed into the cramped dark void between the inner wall and the old stone well shaft, the proximity was suffocating. Eliza's back was pressed against the cold, damp stone, while William's massive frame shielded her from the wooden slats. She could hear his heart thundering against his ribs, a frantic human beat that betrayed the stoic mask of the Duke. "Why didn't you stop?" she whispered, her breath hitching as his face hovered inches from hers in the shadows. "After the 10th letter. After the 20th, why did you keep pretending to be a dying man?" William's hand found hers in the dark, his fingers interlocking with hers with a desperate strength. "Because Jack was the only version of me you could ever love," he confessed, his voice barely a thread of sound. "If I told you I was the Duke of Ashbourne, you would have sharpened your prose into a shield. You would have been polite. You would have been distant. I couldn't lose the way you looked at my soul, Eliza. Even if that soul was wearing a stolen name." The front door of the cottage splintered open with a deafening crash. "Search every corner," a voice boomed, cold, cultured and devoid of mercy. It was Victor Vane. "The Duke is here. And more importantly, find the girl. I want to see the face that made the Iron Heart bleed ink for 4 months." Eliza felt a cold dread wash over her. Through the slats she saw the flickers of lanterns passing by. The intruders were tossing her modest belongings, her father's books, her sewing basket, her precious inkwells, shattering them against the floorboards. Every crash felt like a violation of the only world she had ever known. Suddenly, a heavy shadow stopped right in front of the pantry. Eliza held her breath until her lungs burned. A red herring appeared in the form of a floorboard creaking in the opposite corner of the kitchen. Alfred had intentionally knocked over a chair in the cellar entrance to draw them away. "In the cellar," one of the henchmen shouted, and the heavy footsteps receded toward the back of the house. In the momentary silence, William leaned his forehead against Eliza's. The tension between them wasn't just the fear of death. It was the magnetic pull of two people who had bared their hearts to each other before they had ever seen each other's eyes. "If we get out of this," William whispered, his thumb brushing against her knuckles. I will spend the rest of my life earning the right to your letters. Don't make promises to a woman who hasn't forgiven you yet, Eliza replied, though her grip on his hand tightened. She saw a flicker of hope in his silver eyes, but it was quickly eclipsed. She realized then that Vane wasn't just looking for William. He was looking for the documents William had mentioned, the ones that could ruin Vane's empire. And she realized something even more terrifying. She knew where they were. William had tucked a heavy, sealed parchment into the binding of her 30th letter for safekeeping weeks ago, sent via a trusted courier who had clearly been a double agent. The obstacles were mounting. Vane found that letter, he had everything. If he found them, they were dead. The 30th letter, Eliza hissed, her eyes widening. William, it's on the vanity. I kept it separate because it felt heavier. William's blood ran cold. The very thing they needed to destroy Vane was sitting in plain sight. As he prepared to lung out of the crawl space to retrieve it, the pantry door was ripped off its hinges. The light of a lantern flooded their hiding spot. Victor Vane stood there, a cruel smile twisting his thin lips, holding the blood-stained copy of Eliza's first letter in one hand and a flintlock pistol in the other. Found you, Vane purred. The Duke and his little lark. How poetic. The barrel of the flintlock was a cold, black eye staring directly into the crawl space. Victor Vane stepped closer, the lantern in his hand swinging like a pendulum of doom. William shifted, his body tensing to spring, a coiled predator ready to die for the woman behind him. Stay back, William, Vane murmured, his voice smooth as silk over gravel. Or the girl dies before she can hear the best part of the story. Eliza felt the rough stone of the well shaft biting into her spine. What story? She spat, her voice trembling but defiant. You've broken into my home, you've hunted a man who was once your peer. What more is there to tell? Vane chuckled, a hollow sound that chilled the marrow of her bones. He reached into his coat and pulled out a yellowed, official-looking document, not one of Eliza's letters but something far older. He tossed it onto the floorboards between them. You think you're just a humble lark, living in a rat-trap cottage, don't you, Eliza? You think your father, Thomas Starling, was just a failed academic who died in debt. Vane leaned in, his eyes gleaming with a sadistic delight. Thomas Starling didn't lose his fortune to bad investments. He lost it because he was the rightful executor of the Ashbourne Northern Territories, the very land the Duke here stands upon. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Eliza looked at William, but the Duke's face was a mask of sudden pale shock. My father. He was a clerk, Eliza whispered. He was the man who held the original deeds, Vane countered, his gaze flickering to William. Deeds that the previous Duke, William's father, misplaced, to ensure the line of succession remained undisputed. Your family wasn't poor by accident, Eliza. You were kept poor by the Ashbournes. They turned your legacy into a footstool. The revelation shattered the fragile bubble of trust Eliza had begun to rebuild. She looked at William, the man who had claimed to love her soul. Was this why he had sought her out? Was the dying soldier, routine not just a romantic whim, but a calculated move to monitor the daughter of the man his family had ruined? William, she breathed, the word a question and a plea. I didn't know, William said, his voice raw, his silver eyes searching hers with a desperate intensity. Eliza, I swear on my life I thought your father was exactly who you said he was. I came here for the letters, for you. A touching sentiment, Vane interrupted, but a lie remains a lie. Whether it's a name or a kingdom, the Ashbournes take what they want. And now I'll take what I want. He leveled the pistol at William's chest. The 30th letter, Your Grace. The one containing the trade manifest that would hang me. Give it to me, and perhaps I'll let the girl live to mourn her stolen inheritance. William didn't hesitate. He reached slowly into his greatcoat, but instead of the letter, he pulled out a heavy gold signet ring, the seal of his house. You want power, Vane? You want the Ashbourne legacy? Here. He flung the heavy ring at Vane's face. It was the split-second distraction they needed. As Vane flinched, William lunged out of the crawlspace with the speed of a strike. The pistol discharged with a deafening crack, the ball whistling past Eliza's ear and embedding itself in the spice rack. William and Vane collided in a chaos of limbs and steel. The lantern fell, shattering on the floor, and the spilled oil ignited instantly. A line of fire raced across the wooden planks, fueled by the very ink Eliza had used to write her 40 letters. "Run, Eliza!" William roared, his hands locked around Vane's throat as they tumbled toward the growing flames. "Get to the woods. Don't look back." But as Eliza scrambled out of the crawlspace, she saw the 30th letter, the one containing the evidence, sitting on her vanity, only inches away from the encroaching fire. If it burned, Vane's crimes disappeared forever. She stayed to grab it, the roof might collapse on all of them. The stakes had reached their zenith. It wasn't just about love or a lie anymore. It was about justice for her father, the truth of her bloodline, and the man who might have been her greatest enemy, or her only hope. The world became a roaring tunnel of orange and black. The fire, fed by the dry floorboards and the stacks of paper Eliza had kept for years, climbed the walls with terrifying hunger. Eliza lunged for the vanity, her fingers screaming as they brushed against the blistering wood, and snatched the 30th letter just as a heavy timber beam groaned and plummeted from the ceiling. The impact shook the earth. A wall of fire and debris slammed down between her and the two men wrestling on the floor. "William!" she screamed, her voice lost in the cacophony of shattering glass and the howl of the wind rushing into the broken house. Through the veil of smoke she saw a shadow rise, tall and broad. For a heartbeat, hope flared in her chest, but then the figure stepped through the haze. It was Vane. Blood streamed down his face from where William's signet ring had caught him, and his eyes were wide with a manic, murderous light. He held a jagged shard of mirror in one hand. William was nowhere to be seen, buried under the blackened remains of the pantry wall. "The letter, Eliza," Vane rasped, coughing as the thick smoke filled his lungs. "Give it to me, or I ensure the Duke's grave is also his crematorium." Eliza backed away, her lungs burning, the precious parchment clutched to her chest. She looked at the wreckage where William had fallen. The man who had lied to her. The man whose family had stripped her of her birthright. The man who, moments ago, had thrown himself into a bullet to save her life. She was alone. Alfred was nowhere to be found, likely intercepted by the other enforcers. The house she had called a sanctuary was now a furnace. She felt the crushing weight of despair. Everything she had built, every hope she had nurtured in those 40 letters, was being turned to ash. The man she loved was likely dead, and the man she hated was closing in. "He's gone, Eliza," Vane sneered, stepping over a lick of flame. "He was a ghost the moment he stepped into this valley. Just like your father. Just like your future." With a burst of adrenaline born from pure desperation, Eliza didn't run for the door, she ran for the window. She vaulted over the sill, the cold night air hitting her like a physical blow, and tumbled into the snow. She didn't stop. She ran into the dense, skeletal woods, the branches clawing at her face and tearing her dress. Behind her, she heard the cottage explode as the heat reached the oil stores in the cellar. The light of the blast illuminated the woods, casting long, terrifying shadows. She was a woman alone in the dark, hunted by a syndicate, carrying a secret that could topple a dukedom, and mourning a love that had been built on a foundation of sand. She collapsed at the base of an old, gnarled oak tree, her breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. The cold began to seep into her bones, replacing the heat of the fire with a numbing, hopeless lethargy. She looked at the letter in her hand. The ink was smudged, the paper scorched. "Forgive me, Jack," she whispered to the empty woods, the name a bittersweet ache in her throat. "Forgive me for believing in a lie." She closed her eyes, the sound of the wind mimicking the rustle of paper, feeling as though she were finally drifting away into the same silence she had tried to save Jack from. The separation was total, from her home, from her past, and from the man who had occupied her every thought for 4 months. She was at her breaking point, shivering in the shadows of a world that wanted her erased. The numbing cold of the forest floor began to feel like a heavy blanket, inviting Eliza to simply stop fighting. Her fingers were so stiff she could barely feel the parchment of the 30th letter. Everything was gone, the cottage, the letters, the man who had occupied her dreams. But as the silence of the woods deepened, a sound cut through the winter air. It wasn't the crackle of fire or the shout of a hunter. It was a whistle. Low and melodic, it was a tune she recognized from her own descriptions in the 12th letter, the song her father used to hum while working in the garden. "Eliza." The voice was weak, raspy from smoke, but it acted like a jolt of lightning to her heart. She forced herself up, her knees shaking, and looked toward the edge of the clearing. Stumbling through the brush, supported by a blood-stained Alfred, was William. His greatcoat was charred, his face was masked in soot and blood, but his eyes, those silver eyes, were fixed on her with a ferocity that defied death itself. "William!" she cried, the despair breaking as she ran toward him. They collided in the snow, William falling to his knees as he pulled her into a crushing embrace. The heat of his body against hers was the most real thing she had ever felt. In that moment the deception of Jack and the weight of the Ashbourne name vanished. There was only the man who had crawled through fire to find her. "I thought you were in the pantry. The beam fell?" She sobbed into his shoulder. "I found the old well shaft," William wheezed, clutching her back. "The one you told me about. I dropped into the water just as the roof gave way. Alfred pulled me out from the external vent." He pulled back, his hands framing her face. "Eliza, listen to me. I heard what Vane said. About your father. About the deeds. He wasn't lying about the theft, but he was lying about me. I spent years wondering why my father grew so reclusive, why he hid the northern records. I didn't know it was because he was sitting on a stolen throne. I didn't know the woman I was falling in love with through paper was the woman I owed a kingdom to." Eliza looked at him, searching his face. The vulnerability she had felt in his letters was there now, raw and bleeding. "You're giving it back?" she whispered. "The land, the title?" "I don't want a kingdom that belongs to you," William said, his voice regaining its steel. "I want to be the man you wrote to. But first we have to finish this. Vane thinks we're dead. He's heading for the mountain pass to meet his buyers. If he gets away, the evidence of his crimes and your father's legacy dies with him." Eliza looked down at the letter in her hand. The 30th letter. Inside wasn't just a trade manifest. It was the original unedited record of the Starling holdings that William had tucked away for safety, realizing its importance even before he knew Eliza's identity. "He won't get away," Eliza said, her voice dropping the last of its fear. She felt a surge of inner strength, a courage born from 40 letters of sharing her soul. She wasn't just a victim of a lie anymore. She was the architect of her own justice. "He's heading for the old stone bridge. It's the only way out of the valley tonight. If we cut through the devil's throat, we can get there before his horses." William looked at her, a proud, pained smile touching his lips. "Lead the way, Eliza Starling. Let's show him what happens when a lark decides to hunt a wolf." Hope ignited in the dark. They weren't just fleeing, they were uniting. The love born of ink was being forged in the snow, and the key to the final confrontation was clutched in a woman's hand. The devil's throat was a jagged scar of limestone and ice, a treacherous shortcut that only someone born to these mountains would dare traverse in the dead of night. Eliza led the way, her boots finding purchase on frozen roots, while William followed, his hand never leaving the hilt of his blade. They reached the old stone bridge just as the moon broke through the heavy clouds, illuminating the gorge below in a ghostly silver light. Minutes later, the rhythmic thunder of hooves echoed against the canyon walls. Victor Vane appeared at the head of a small column of riders, his face a mask of triumph and exhaustion. He believed the Duke was ash and the girl was a memory. He didn't see the two figures standing in the center of the narrow bridge until he was nearly upon them. "Halt!" William's voice rang out, a command that seemed to stop the wind itself. Vane pulled his horse back, the animal rearing in terror. His jaw dropped as he stared at the blackened, bloodied man standing before him. "Impossible. I saw the roof collapse. You're a ghost." "I am the man you tried to erase," William said, stepping forward into the moonlight. "And this is the woman whose life you tried to steal." Eliza stepped out from William's shadow, holding the 30th letter high. The parchment fluttered in the freezing wind. "This is the end of the line, Vane. I have the manifest. I have the Starling deeds. And I have the Duke of Ashbourne as my witness." Vane's eyes darted to his men, but they were hesitating. They saw a man who had survived a furnace. They saw the iron heart looking like a vengeful god of war. Desperation took hold of Vane. He lunged from his saddle, pulling a hidden dagger from his boot. "If I can't have the Empire, no one will." He rushed at Eliza, but William was faster. The clash of steel on steel shrieked through the night as William intercepted the blow. They grappled at the very edge of the bridge, the drop into the churning black water of the gorge below a terrifying 400 feet. "The letters, William!" Eliza screamed as Vane's men began to dismount. Show them the truth. In a final masterstroke twist, Alfred appeared from the tree line behind the riders, flanked by the local village militia. Men and women Eliza had known her whole life, armed with hunting rifles and pitchforks. They weren't fighting for a duke. They were fighting for Eliza, the girl who had mended their lace and shared their bread. William threw Vane back with a guttural roar, his sword point hovering inches from the villain's throat. It's over, Victor. Your own men have seen you fail. Your buyers are being intercepted at the pass by the garrison. You have nothing left but the truth. Vane looked at the circle of angry villagers and the bloodied duke. He looked at Eliza, who stood with the poise of the noblewoman she was always meant to be. With a snarl of defeat he dropped the dagger. You think this changes anything? Vane spat even as Alfred's men bound his hands. He still lied to you, Eliza. He still stole your heart with a dead man's name. William turned to Eliza, his sword lowering. The silence that followed was the loudest moment of her life. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, charred scrap of paper, the only piece of her letters he had managed to save from the fire. It was the closing of her 40th letter. You wrote that you loved me because I was a man who understood the value of a single heartbeat, William said softly, ignoring the crowd around them. I am that man. Whether I am Jack or William, my heart beats for the woman who wrote those words. If you want me to leave, I will give you the deeds, the estate, and my absence. But if you can forgive the man who found his soul in your ink, stay. The triumph wasn't in the defeat of Vane. It was in the look of raw, authentic love in William's eyes. Eliza walked to him, took the charred scrap of paper and pressed it to her heart. Jack Dawson is dead, she whispered, her voice carrying over the roar of the water below. But William Darcy, he has a lot of letters to answer. The winter snows eventually thawed, giving way to a spring that the valley had never seen the likes of before. The charred remains of the cottage were gone, but in their place stood a magnificent garden of jasmine and wild roses, a living monument to the words that had saved 2 souls. Eliza Starling stood on the veranda of the restored Starling Manor, no longer a drafty relic of a forgotten past, but a house filled with light and the scent of fresh ink. The deeds had been returned, her father's name cleared, and the wealth of the Northern Territories restored to its rightful heir. But as she looked out over the rolling green hills, she realized that the gold in the bank was nothing compared to the peace in her heart. She had grown from a lonely girl whispering her secrets to the wind into a woman of substance and power. She had learned that forgiveness isn't a gift you give to someone else, but a bridge you build for yourself to walk across. The deception had been a fire, yes, but like the phoenix, their relationship had risen from the ashes, stronger and more authentic than a lie could ever be. A pair of strong arms wrapped around her waist from behind, and she leaned back into the familiar warmth of William Darcy. He no longer wore the heavy, cold mask of the Iron Heart. His eyes, once like flint, were now soft, reflecting the vibrant life they had built together. The post has arrived, William whispered into her hair, his voice playful. There is a letter for the Duchess of Ashbourne. Eliza smiled, turning in his arms. Oh, and who is it from? From a man who still can't believe his luck, he replied, handing her a single envelope sealed with his own signet ring, the same ring he had once thrown at a villain to protect her. Inside was no official document or royal decree. It was a letter, the 41st letter, written in a hand that was steady and bold. It didn't speak of titles or territories. It spoke of the way her laughter sounded like the first day of spring and how he promised to spend every day of his life being the man she had seen through the ink of her imagination. The romantic subplot had found its fulfillment not in a crown, but in a quiet, mutual understanding. They had moved beyond the beautiful lie, into a magnificent truth. Every question had been answered, every loose end tied with the same care Eliza used to bind her parchment. As they walked together toward the gardens, the shadow of the past was finally gone. There was only the sun, the scent of the earth, and the infinite promise of a future they would write together, one day at a time.